Hello, everyone. We're going to get started here in just a second after everyone gets connected with their audio. Okay, I think we should get rolling here. We're at the top of the hour. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Megan Dotson, and I'm the program manager for the National American Indian and Alaska Native Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. And today's webinar is American Indian and Alaska Native Mental Health, the Role of Spirituality. Next slide, please. Okay, and as you can see here, this event is brought to you by the National American Indian and Alaska Native Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, which is located in the University of Iowa. And we're part of a national MHTTC network, as this map shows. So this project is supported by SAMHSA, and the content is developed by the presenter, and the opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of SAMHSA, HHS, or the American Indian and Alaska Native MHTTC. So following today's event, we will send out a follow-up email to which will include links to the presentation slides and recording, information about how to request and receive CEUs, and the link to our evaluation survey called GIPRA. Although we're gathered virtually today, we want to take the time to acknowledge the land and pay respect to the indigenous nations whose homelands were forcibly taken and inhabited. So please take a moment to read this land acknowledgement, which was created by 3 members of our team, Ella and Keely Driscoll and Sean Bear. And I must give credit to this slide, which was enhanced recently by Mr. Ray Daw with the map and made a little more pretty. Thanks, Ray. So today's speaker, we have Mr. Ray Daw, and he's Dene from New Mexico. He's currently a Native American behavioral health consultant, and his career has been largely within and around the Navajo Nation, Native nonprofits, and most recently in rural Alaska in both inpatient and outpatient settings. His work in behavioral health has been heavily geared towards developing Native trauma-appropriate approaches that are healing and effective in tribal behavioral health program prevention, intervention, and treatment services. And his work includes extensive experience as a consultant with SAMHSA in program development and evaluation, culturally based prevention and intervention services, public policy, grant reviewing, and American Indian, Alaska Native modalities. He's also a trainer in motivational interviewing and historical trauma. So with that, we're happy to have Ray with us today, and we hope you enjoy the webinar that we have in store for you. So with that, Ray, go ahead and take it away. Thank you.
Okie dokie. Good morning, everyone. Yate. Kaidana, Tanafini. Shiki Aning Shlido, Tlazatlanabash Chin, Sitna Jenny, that's a che. Do 20 Etashan, my toy hodie. Hot Arizona, Ade Nasha. Die the Nanshla Jitana. In my introduction to everyone, there are likely Navajo folks here in the webinar with us, and I'm required by our protocol to introduce myself appropriately in the Tenewe, which I've done. And that'll touch into some of my discussion with you later on. But nonetheless, we have 4 objectives here that I'm going to work on covering. First is to define and describe mental health in the generally accepted sense, and then also to describe Eurocentric approaches to spirituality and mental health. There are approaches in there that we sometimes don't become aware of or are uninformed about. The third is to describe Native approaches to spirituality and mental health. We're very aware of some of these, but to just kind of ground them in our presentation today. The fourth objective is to describe the Nez-centric or Navajo-centric perspectives on Navajo well-being, or mental well-being, I should say. So these are the four objectives that I laid out in this webinar with us. We have another, almost 50 minutes here to go. So I'll begin the presentation. Next slide, please. So I have a question for you. First of all, put your responses in chat. What is your perspective on this topic of mental health? What is a mental health disorder? Is my first question to you. And just kind of write down what you understand a mental health disorder can be in chat. So I'll give you a few seconds to do that. What is a mental health disorder? Samantha writes, disorder is something that's developed. Illness is inherited. Good response. Haley says it's a chemical imbalance. David mentions that it is likely a psychological distress that disrupts daily functioning. Kimberly says right now many are culturally defined. Good response. Eric says it's a mind-altering psychological dysfunction. So those are some of the responses that I'm seeing right now. Something coming from unaddressed trauma is what Joy says. Rosemary, someone who experiences the other side in order to cope with their pain and distress. Mental health disorder, according to Kelly, a disabling condition, something you desire an intervention or assistance for, something upsetting to you or your loved ones that is negatively affecting your quality of life. Jason mentions something that affects both brain and spirit. Heather, being out of balance or the accumulation of what is not being heard. Patterns of feeling, behaving that impair functioning is what Keturah mentions. Elizabeth mentions mental health disorder stems from the brain's inability to send typical signals, have typical responses to stimuli. Wow, we're getting a whole lot of really great responses here. Okay. Go down to the bottom. David Garcia says, a person who is out of balance with their physical, emotional, and spiritual self. Excellent responses, everyone. Thank you. And I think in looking at your chat responses, you've covered a whole gamut of what a mental health disorder can be. But narrowing it down, even a mental health disorder, according to the work that many of us engage in behavioral health, is laid out within the DSM system. And that's how mental health disorders are described. And here's a diagram that shows some of the mental health disorders that can be looked at. Next slide, please. Indian Health Services, because we're all working with Native American people and the IHS we consider to be the place from within which most, if not all, primary care and mental health services are provided. It has this definition. of what mental health is with this description. And I thought it would be valuable to ground ourselves to the IHS viewpoint of what mental health is. And down in the second paragraph, it's mentioned that mental illnesses and disorders are conditions that specifically affect a person's thinking, feelings, mood, and behavior. That is what they consider to be a mental health disorder. Wanted to kind of ground us to the IHS description of mental health. Go ahead. Next slide, please. So I'd like to ask you once again in chat to write in chat 2 mental health disorders you think have the most negative impact on Native Americans. Go into chat again and do that. I'd like to see your responses. And I'll read some out while I'm looking at it. Carrie mentions PTSD, depression. Eric says depression, anxiety. Haley, depression, PTSD. Jay says historical trauma. Christy, PTSD and depression. Alexa, trauma and depression. Eric says depression, substance use disorder. Okay. Heather mentions depression and anxiety. Elizabeth points out anxiety disorder, substance use disorder. Devery says depression and anxiety. Samantha Nelson says borderline personality disorder, PTSD. Gail says depressive disorders, anxiety. Rosemary, depression is her comment. She includes in there PTSD. Jason says intergenerational trauma and depression. Calora, substance use disorder, traumas. These often come from grief. Christina says schizophrenia and substance use. Kimberly says substance abuse and trauma. Mara says depression. And looking at these responses that you've offered, thank you very much for doing that also. Depression seems to be a number one, the primary disorder that we note in our listing here of mental health disorders that you encounter or that you're aware of. A second disorder that comes up fairly regularly in your listing are substance use disorder and then anxiety. Lisa says generational trauma. Alexandra, depression, PTSD. So we're seeing a really good listing, and the reason why I thought this would be a good question to ask or pose is because we're all in the field, and knowing that most of you are practitioners, clinicians, it's good to get our responses shared with each other, what we're seeing or what we're aware of in our particular areas. And I think that the good number of responses indicating that depression is significant is right in line with reports that we're seeing from across many parts of Native country, if not in the United States, particularly during these really difficult times we're having during the pandemic. And some of the pandemic responses that we're seeing kind of move a lot more of our population towards depression, anxiety, and substance use disorders. We're seeing a lot of reports about that, I think. So, and unfortunately, because many of our agencies are not doing face-to-face work per se, and we're having to rely on virtual ways of connecting with our patients, we're seeing more increases on that, I think. Next slide, please. And this goes to the question that I asked earlier, and looking at reports across Native country that I mentioned that talk about high depression rates, significantly high anxiety rates, and high substance use disorders across American Indian, Alaska Native territories. And this chart basically kind of reaffirms what a lot of you wrote in chat and how you responded to the question that I presented. So the exercise in this one basically is to more or less affirm what we are experiencing as practitioners with our people, that these are primary concerns that we have in our work. And whether you're doing prevention or intervention work or treatment work, these are the three things that we continually encounter in our efforts to improve the quality of life for our people. Thank you. So we'll move on to the second slide. So being aware that depression, anxiety, and substance use disorders are significant across Native American country, then we take into consideration the adverse health conditions that come up as a result of that. And we see that suicide rates for our people are 1.6 times higher than the US all races rate, that our communities are significantly more likely to report past year alcohol and substance use disorders than any other ethnic population. Also that American Indian Alaska Native women are reported as having among the highest rates of sexual assault and intimate partner violence, victimization. And these are consequences from the three mental disorders that we've mentioned, as well as PTSD, as well as other things that we're encountering in our communities. We also have the highest male mortality rate in any other ethnic group in the United States, which is another example of traumatization. These are all conditions that traumatize our people and our communities, whether we're in urban settings or whether we're in reservation settings, because there are two different settings. So this is where we are and what we continually have to deal with in the work that we're doing in behavioral health. Next slide, please. Consequently, these conditions bring to us a number of efforts across the country and across Native country that is important that we end up getting engaged with. Way on the top right part of the corner, of course, is the COVID virus, which is really overlays a lot of these mitigates the social impact of mental illness across the United States and even across Indian country. And these are logos or symbols that are developed to point out the need for targeting services and targeting our efforts accordingly. We have unemployment, and we have incarceration, domestic violence, child abuse, neglect, unemployment, and missing and murdered Indigenous women. Concerns right now that we're having to deal with. So, and I think a lot of you are probably involved in some of these initiatives and efforts. Yeah. Well, thank you, Sandra, for your comment. That is a really nice sticker that's pointed out there for us. It's a real beautiful sticker and poignant. Next slide, please. Now we begin to get into a second part of our talk, which is talking about the DSM-5, which we looked at previously, but then looking at mental health from a Native American perspective. And the thing I want to point out here, Sean Baer, who's a colleague with Megan and I, talk about this in much of our work, is that we have the DSM-5, the diagnostic system on this side. We also have our native approaches to diagnoses, assessment, and intervention services. And oftentimes we don't look at them as in conflict with each other. Oftentimes they're complementary to each other, particularly because a good portion of our native Alaska Native populations are assimilated or acculturated into the Euro-American ways. We all are in some degree. And the degree of our assimilation or acculturation kind of it's like a balance, informs us as to how strongly we employ a DSM approach towards mental health and wellness. And that's a thing that I always keep in mind when I talk to a Native person, is how assimilated and acculturated are they? Do they have awareness of the tribal ways that they come from, or the native ways for healing? If they do, then that kind of points out that it might be valuable to have some discussion about that as well. So this is our perspective, or my perspective on the Euro-American system and the Native American system of health and well-being. They do complement each other in many cases. And I certainly don't toss out the DSM system as being irrelevant, because I'm trained as a clinician also. And as a clinician, it's valuable for me to know symptoms as they're described within the DSM. So that's a point that I think is really, really key to have. And the Native system, of course, is heavily cultural based as well as the DSM system. The DSM is a culturally based system. And so we can appreciate that from both sides. And it makes it valuable to know each way. So let's begin a discussion about the Euro-American approach to spirituality and mental health. Next slide, please. So I have a question. What is this gentleman known for? William R. Miller. Anybody? Put it in chat. MI. Okay, Elizabeth, motivational interviewing. Okay, consistently. You're right. Dr. Miller is well versed and one of the developers of motivational interviewing techniques, but he's also very well known for brief motivational strategies, from within which MI is designed. Brief motivational strategies. He has a number of books and publications and a whole slew of articles written around brief motivational approaches towards treatment. In fact, there's a whole treatment improvement protocol within the SAMHSA system around brief motivational interventions that he had a large role in putting together for SAMHSA. So if you're interested more on his work in mental health, look for the SAMHSA TIP on brief motivational strategies. I forget the number of it, but he's very well versed with that. But the thing that surprises many people, that Dr. Miller is an ordained minister. And as an ordained minister, he has real strong interest in the role of spirituality and treatment, and has written, like in this case, a book and a whole number of articles related to spirituality and treatment in his work that is unappreciated or not as talked about. And actually his knowledge around his interest in spirituality that does impact the design of MI. In the Native American motivational interviewing manual that he worked on putting together with Camilla Venner at the beginning of the MI manual, actually is a prayer that he insisted be put in there, because he was very aware of Native approaches towards helping people. So I wanted to begin this part to share with you that there are a whole lot of folks in behavioral health, psychology, psychiatry, because Dr. Miller is a psychiatrist as well as psychologist, who have strong interest in spirituality and its role in treatment, and have done great work on describing their interest and their efforts to have that appreciated as well. So I encourage you to read his book and the articles that he has put out. He's now retired, but still has a major influence on all of us. Next slide, please. In addition, there are other resources that we have available, and there's just a few that you can look at after the webinar, because you'll be getting the PowerPoint. They can kind of steer you towards the Euro-American approaches towards including spirituality and therapy, or understanding spirituality and therapy. There are some books that you can look at and begin including in your library. Next slide, please. Couple more references on spirituality and mental health as well. And you can see by the names of the people there, they're well-learned people, meaning these are people with doctors and doctors in front of the name. So they're well-grounded individuals within the DSM system as well. As I go along with the presentation, feel free to put any questions you have in chat, or any ideas or responses you have in chat. That will really help also. So when you do a Google search on the topic of spirituality and mental health, you'll see these references coming up, and I encourage you to do that if you have a particular interest in this topic, which I think you do because you're here today. Next slide, please. I see a question popping up. Is there a question for psychology in my language? Well, Eric, not per se, not in the sense that, not in the same form and fashion that the word psychology comes from. Psychology is, I think, this is a study of the mind, and as a scientific endeavor, kind of designed that way. The Navajo way, no, we don't have a word for psychology like that. And I think you'll find that in many, if not all, Native American languages, there's no specific word similar to psychology. Thank you, Joy, for your comment about trauma and the doctrine of discovery. Thank you. So, and in this particular part of the presentation, I would imagine that most, if not all of you, are familiar with the Serenity Prayer. And I will say that I don't consider myself a recovering person, but I really give a lot of value and credence to the Serenity Prayer. I think it's very grounding and very informative and very helpful. And like Jason says, grounds me daily, even though I'm not a recovering person. And there have been times in my work when I've had business cards and I put the Serenity Prayer in the back of my card to highlight it as a very grounding prayer. And one of the reasons why I like the Serenity Prayer and included my teachings across my work is that it has concepts that are very similar to the Navajo way of thinking. That we seek. In Navajo, we say, we seek serenity. And In Navajo, there are things that we know, are aware of, that we can't change. And we were taught to be alert to those things. And we're taught to be resilient, to have courage to the things that are that we can have an impact with. And also to be totally aware and have knowledge and wisdom to know what we can change and what we cannot change, and to move ahead through life that way. And that's how the Serenity Prayer has value for me as a Navajo man, and as a Navajo practitioner, as a Navajo clinician. So I wanted to share those thoughts with you on how the Serenity Prayer is valuable. And Samantha, it's good that you work with teens, because I think it's very grounding for teens also. But like I mentioned, I printed the Serenity Prayer at the back of my business cards when I'm introducing myself to people, so that they. And oftentimes I take my business card with the Serenity Prayer on it, and I show the Serenity Prayer first, not my name and all that other stuff that we have in business cards, because I want people to know where I'm coming from. So, and if you're aware that Serenity Prayer comes from Alcoholics Anonymous, the recovery movement, and the recovery process, the recovery movement itself has a whole array of, as a system, really, and that system of support that comes from the recovery movement is really impactful to a lot of people. And that's why courts and a lot of behavioral health programs go to AA, NA, and other organizations, support groups like that, as a way to get our folks grounded. But AA is a very spiritually grounded process. Next slide, please. The other recovery groups that support groups, they're really recovery groups, but we kind of reframe them as support groups, are not only AA, but adult children of alcoholics, and Al-Anon and Alateen, just to name a few. And the value that they have is that these support groups offer advice, they offer help, they offer support. You like in AA, you have someone that you meet and ends up becoming your mentor and your guide through your recovery. And then in AA, and like these other groups, they offer tips. There's a whole lot of literature on how to manage life and how to understand life that are offered through these support groups, and there's assistance involved, from these groups, and there's guidance. So these are the kind of like 6 primary functions of these support groups that are out there in the country. And like I said, it's just a few of them. There's support groups for a lot of different conditions that we encounter in our life today. But I wanted to mention that, and the thing that kind of, for me, that I see the word connection, the thing that connects them all is their spiritually based approaches, and that's a really nice thing that I think is good to acknowledge from my part, and why it is that we end up offering referrals to support groups as part of our work in many of the organizations that we are involved in. I don't know of any organization that doesn't make referrals to AA or NA or Al-Anon or these other support groups. Okay. Next slide, please. I'm watching the time as I go along. We have, I want to try to leave some time at the end for questions and answers. So on to the topic of American Indian, Alaska Native spirituality. There is a treatment improvement protocol called TIP 61 that is out there in the Samsha library. On page 20 of TIP 61 is this phrase: that the Lakota culture has very specific rituals and practices for grieving that allowed for a year of publicly expressed mourning, followed by a ceremony to heal the grief. And what happened? U.S. policies outlawed Native ceremonies, interrupted the process of grieving over events such as the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890, in which the U.S. Army killed between 150 and 300 Lakota men, women, and children. A reason why this is mentioned in tip 61 is that the acknowledgement that many of our ways, spiritual ways and ceremonies, were forced to disappear, if not become more hidden. And it wasn't until the Religious Freedom Act came into being in the 1970s that we were essentially giving official permission to practice our ways more publicly. It was very common in Navajo country, for example, for Navajo ceremonies to be shut down or closed or raided before the Indian Religious Freedoms Act was enacted. And a lot of our ceremonies became very private and very family-centric instead of being public. And many Native American religious leaders were sent to prisons and insane asylums in the late 1800s and early 1900s because of their insistence that they heal and offer ceremonial services, healing services to their people. One example that comes to mind is that about 15 Hopi religious leaders were sent to, I believe, a California prison, I think it was San Quentin, in the early 1900s, 15. And that was very common. Among Navajo people, the same kind of thing happened. And I know I'm aware of instances in Alaska where Alaska Native healers were marginalized, seriously marginalized, or sent off to jail or prison because they kept wanting to help the people in the ways that they knew. And so this is part of our trauma and part of our history, and how it is that the renewed interest in Native spirituality has been really good to see, particularly in the last 30 years. And there are surveys conducted that show that even in urban settings, as many as 70% of Native Americans in urban settings seek traditional healing, traditional healers, and spiritual approaches towards improving their lives. So we have a lot of our people who navigate towards the approaches that are indigenous to us. And that's the importance of this slide, I think, is to acknowledge our traumatic histories and how we're working on recovering the ways that have been hidden for decades and generations. Thank you. Next slide, please. Rosemary asked a really good question on why our traditional healing medicines aren't evidence-based yet. A large part is because of the disconnect we have with academia. To become an evidence-based practice, there's a good amount of research involved towards being accepted as an evidence-based practice. And that's the nature of that system. And as we are aware, many of our practitioners don't have those kinds of Euro-American ways of understanding how to do research and how to publish and how to write, so that they can be moved towards evidence-based practice. So we have this disconnect. And then the other thing that really impacts that is that our traditional ways and our traditional ceremonies are almost always grounded in our language. And Navajo system, for example, is heavily language grounded. And many of our words and phrases in the Navajo language are not translatable into English. So we have this translation problem from our native language to English that exists. It makes it really hard to do the kind of work that you're asking about, making our traditional ways evidence-based. And you know, if we and that's a problem that's going to be there for as long as I'm around, I think. And so that's how I want to respond to your question, Rosemary. There's some distrust about traditional practices. Yeah, you're right about that, Carrie. And some of that distrust is because we do have people who say they are traditional healers and grounded that way, who really aren't, and really mess up true healing practices the way most of our people do that. You know, these fake shamans or fake healers really have more of an audience, I think, than our well-versed and well-grounded traditional healers. Let's see. Next slide, please. Yeah, you're right, Carrie. The Sweat Lodge in Sedona is a really good example. You know, the guy that just abused our ways, our inipis. Yeah, Jesus did not speak English either, but and then I'm chuckling because the Latin, when Christianity moved into Rome and became more Latinized, then it became a lot more appreciated, I think. And eventually, within I think like 100, 150 years, Rome was a Christian, was Christianized. So it is okay. So what are some? So the next question here is for you. Put your answers in chat. What are some native-centric approaches to recovery, healing, or wellness that are out there? Go ahead and put your responses in chat. I'd like to see what you have. The drum circle. Okay, thank you, Joey. Smudging, prayers, drumming, yeah. Talking circles, white bison, yep. Sweats, good responses. Traditional medicine, ceremony, sobriety. Sobriety is a big one. Cultural activities, language, yeah, language is becoming more accepted. The red road. Samantha asks us the question, what is that? Eric, maybe you can unmute and discuss Red Road real briefly.
Hi, yeah, Red Road, and working with the Native American Rehabilitation Association in Oregon, we use the Red Road to Wellbriety. It's similar to AA, but more Native centric, with focus on historical teachings and Native spirituality.
Thank you very much. Very good description. So we're saying go good listing of responses to that question on Native-centric approaches to recovery, healing, and wellness. Thank you very much, everyone. And in this particular slide, you'll see the medicine wheel, which is like I think, adopted and adapted and across Native country, which basically says we are who we are physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and really lays out for us how we incorporate these approaches into the work that a lot of us do, I think. And so for me and a lot of our people, the medicine wheel is the model from which we do our healing work, or in a lot of cases our recovery work, and work towards wellness, because there are 3 different processes there. Next slide, please. Got about 12 minutes. So I have a question here again. How do you refer to God, creator, higher power in your language? And put your responses in chat. Oop. And you'll see my response to that question also. Wankatonka, yeah. Carrie, that's very good. That's a very good response. The Navajo word, the Navajo concept of this question is Tiyen Tene. And Navajo is not a written language per se, and what we've taken is the phonic version of English and adopted it to write out the words that we have. So it's taken me some while to write out the end in there, even though I'm still not sure about some of my spelling. I'm not going to try to wait what John wrote. Can you pronounce that for us, John?
Mizue Kamak Manidug. I reference the spirits around me.
Mm-hmm. Good. Thank you very much for your help.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Good. And so we'll see a whole variety of responses to this question. And that's normal. That's okay. Many of us are taught to be accepting of all the different ways that we visualize and live in our world. Next slide, please. So that's now we move towards where I'm coming from. The Neh way of being. The Neh as a Navajo is how we describe our people, Navajo people in English. We call ourselves the Neh. In our ways, identity is who one is. It's our thoughts, our feelings, our being, our physical being, and our behaviors. That's who we are as Native people, as Navajo people. And the graphic you see on the right side of that statement is a graphic that was designed by a Navajo practitioner, a Navajo man who deeply respect and has in his ways a whole lot of information and ceremonies that he offers. And our being is who we contemplate, who we are as we think of ourselves and our role in the world. And we have prayers that say that we are who we are from the bottom of our feet to the top of our head. everything in between, from the bottom of our feet to the top of our head, is who we are and how we think and feel, and our being, our physical being, and our behaviors is all a big part of that. Next slide, please. In the Navajo way, we are is what we call ourselves. We're sacred people. We're sacred, holy people on earth, is how we formally describe ourselves. We're sacred people on the earth. And as sacred people, we are in the homes or outside the homes, we are given blessings by our deities. And this graphic, drawn by the same Hatati, Navajo Hatati, depicts how the holy people are with us continually, 24/7, and how their presence makes us very sacred people also. This is our approach towards well-being, and our approach to taking care of ourselves. So the Navajo framework doesn't put a lot of time towards mental illness. We don't have manuals like that. Our approach is really towards well-being and mental, and basically just being well. And our prayers and our songs and our ceremonies are geared that way, to keep us centered and focused, and to be good people. Next slide, please. I mentioned that identity is a grounding of who we are, and at the beginning of this webinar, I introduced myself to all of you. I introduced my 4 clans. The 4 clans is who I am as a Navajo man. In my country, when we introduce our clans, and people make relations to us, and through my clans, I'm related to probably 90% of the people in Navajo country, related to. So I end up being a relative to 90% of the people, Navajo people I meet. That's my identity. That's who we are. And this is really similar to how many of our people do their introductions, because that lays out our identity. Next slide, please. In our complicated world, everything has purpose and order. And I have a colleague, a Navajo practitioner, a different one, who drew out the best way he could a Navajo system of blessing our ways of life. And we have 4 quadrants too in the Navajo way. But our colors are different from the medicine wheel. We have white to the east, blue to the south, yellow to the west, and black to the north. Those are our 4 primary colors in the beauty way, the blessed way that we have. And when you look at this after the webinar, and when you get the PowerPoints, you can see how it looks complicated, but it's all one concept. It all narrows down to that, and that gives us purpose in our world and in the ways that we live our life. I wanted to share this with you so you can have a concept of maybe where I'm coming from. Carrie's Twitchini. Oh, it's good to meet you, Carrie. Yeah, Tesha away. My child. Next slide, please. In the Navajo system, our prayers and our songs sustain, as I mentioned earlier, sustain our wellness and our identity. And this is another chart or diagram that shows how we view our lives. You know, we have sacred, very sacred places in our lands, and very sacred things that are valuable to us, like turquoise and white shell and abalone and jet, or minerals that help us in our daily lives as we challenge ourselves and as we live our lives well. And once again, I want to mention that our framework is to be well. That's our framework. And that's the beauty of most Indigenous ways is to be well is the framework. And to move through whatever difficulties and challenges that we have with the blessings of prayer and songs. Next slide, please. There's a whole lot of teachings that are within the Navajo system that I can't get into, but I wanted to give a really quick, very much tip of the iceberg kind of description of where my people come from, or where many Indigenous people do come from. I mentioned the holy people. They teach us to be respectful. They teach us to be attentive and to relate, because that's how they are with us. And this drawing by the Navajo healer, he shows a family surrounded by the holy people. Once again, they're with us all the time, offering us prayers and songs and companionship, leading us through the challenges that we have. I was sharing with a young person last week that a perfect life is a life with challenges and troubles, and being able to get through them well and effectively. That's a perfect life. There's no such thing as a life without trouble. And that's what I'm taught. And what we do in our life that has troubles of a lot of different kinds, some mild and some very severe, is to go through them with respect and attentiveness and relating. So that's what we have to offer. Real quickly, kind of like what they say in a nutshell. The last slide, please. Got a little over here, and thank you for staying with us here. In conclusion, there's my contact information. Feel free to email me, text me if you have any questions after the presentation. And I hope the short time we had with you was good, and that you all have good days and good lives, and you all take care of yourselves in the challenging work that we have today in the pandemic. Mahalo. I have a brother who lived in Hawaii for a while. He's always mahaloing me, and I tell him that often. But thank you for your time, everyone. Megan, any closing comments?
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Ray. That was wonderful. We're going to save the chat here because you have so much information, and I love that we have interacted with the participants today. I think that keeps people very engaged, and I love to see different opinions and information provided. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. And like mentioned before, we will send this in the follow-up email, so be looking for that. And please fill out that GIPRA survey so we can continue to provide these free of charge and support our funder. So again, thank you, Ray. Thank you, Natasha, for running the presentation. And everyone, have a safe and blessed day. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye, everyone. You take care of yourselves. Thank you.